Hi everyone, I'm Louise Axon. I'm going to present our paper, Practitioners' Views on Cybersecurity Control Adoption and Effectiveness by Louise Axon, Arnau, Erola, Alastair, Janse van Rensburg, Janse, Michael Goldsmith, and Sadie Creese. This was research done by us at the University of Oxford, with Janse at the University of Kent, and sponsored by Axis Insurance Company. So the research looks at the relative effectiveness of various cybersecurity risk control options, and also the ways in which they're deployed by organizations in reality. So to begin with, we believe there's a need to comprehend the value of cybersecurity risk controls in reducing cyber risk exposure and the factors that affect their usage, and that this information is important for a range of stakeholders, including researchers, those making cybersecurity decisions within organizations, and external parties such as standards bodies and insurance companies. We felt that cybersecurity practitioners would possess a wealth of knowledge in this area, experiential knowledge gathered over years of working with cybersecurity risk controls in a practical setting, and yet there had been little academic work to date synthesizing their views on the topics of control effectiveness and control deployment. And so we conducted a survey and interviews with cybersecurity practitioners seeking to explore trends and the organizational factors that can impact control effectiveness and control deployment. And although still exploratory, we believe that this methodology could help to identify points of improvement in cybersecurity investment. So these are our two research questions. Firstly, how effective do security practitioners perceive different cybersecurity controls to be in addressing organizational cyber risk? And two, how are different cybersecurity controls deployed in practical environments? Our methodology, so for recruitment, firstly, we aim to reduce the possibility of bias in participant selection by recruiting via a range of different channels. So firstly, via our existing contacts in organizations that employ security practitioners. Secondly, by advertising the survey on LinkedIn and targeting security practitioner contacts in that way. We also distributed the survey via relevant mailing lists for security practitioners, and we attended events for executive level security practitioner groups to promote both the survey and the interview studies. In the online survey, we aim to attain a quantitative account of perceptions of, firstly, the relative effectiveness of the Centre for Internet Security's 20 critical security controls, and secondly, the frequency with which organizations deploy these 20 controls, classes of control. And we chose the Centre for Internet Security's controls because it's widely recognized standard and it's widely used. During the online survey, participants were asked to rate the effectiveness, in their opinion, of each of the 20 Centre for Internet Security controls using a 5-point Likert scale, to select up to 3 most effective and 3 least effective controls using drag and drop to relevant boxes, which I'll show you in the next slide. To rate the frequency of deployment of each control using a 5-point Likert scale. And participants were also offered the opportunity to record any additional comments in free text boxes. And we first ran a pilot of the survey with 3 security practitioners to refine the phrasing and the structure and the clarity of the interface. And for the analysis of the survey, we calculated the mode and the median rating from the Likert scales, and also a comparison of non-neutral scores. And this was because there's discrepancy in the community as to how to treat Likert scale data. And we used a range of different measures. So this was the survey interface that participants were presented with. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list of controls, which would extend further down the page to be all 20 controls in the grey boxes. Participants were asked to use the Likert scale, these 5, to rate the effectiveness of the control, and the values of each Likert scale point would come up on hover, with a don't know option at the side. And they were asked to do the same for control deployments. So how commonly is the control deployed in their opinion? And they were asked to then drag and drop the boxes into the most effective or least effective boxes where relevant to represent their views on up to 3 most effective and up to 3 least effective controls. The controls on the left were listed in a randomized order to reduce possibilities of biasing participants, for example, through consistent placement of boxes in the same parts of the page, consistent placement of the same boxes next to the same most effective bucket over here, for example, might have introduced bias. So we randomized that order. the methodology for the semi-structured interviews, they lasted approximately 30 minutes. They took place face-to-face or over the phone to suit the needs of participants. They were guided by a set of questions which we used aiming to explore the concepts of the online survey in greater depth. And participants were guided towards a discussion of real-world security practice and their perceptions of risk control deployment in organizations and the effectiveness of these controls. So our first set of questions looked at security control deployment, and this included questions on the ways in which decisions are made on control deployment and configuration, the resources used to guide these decisions, the impact of broader considerations such as the interconnection of assets and aggregation of harms, and also perceptions of the most important security controls. Our second set of questions on security control effectiveness looked at perceptions of the concept of security control effectiveness, methods of determining control effectiveness and the data required for this, and methods of determining the residual risk of an organization. And lastly, we looked at the interdependencies between controls, and we used questions to explore practitioners' perceptions of the treatment of interdependencies between controls and the ways in which this impacts on usage and effectiveness. So this subject was included in recognition of the fact that controls are interdependent and that the performance of certain risk controls depends on the performance of other controls. So an example would be many of an organization's controls might depend on how well they have inventoried their assets, without which a firm view of what actually needs to be protected can't be formed. To analyze the interviews, we transcribed audio recordings of the interviews, and we then coded the interviews using template analysis. So online survey results. The survey was completed by 30 participants. So we don't claim statistical significance of the results, but we're really exploring the utility of the method for identifying trends and influencing factors. And we can see the years of cybersecurity experience over here. All participants had at least 3 years of experience, and we can see that most had the majority had at least 10 years of experience in cybersecurity. And on the left here, we can see the job roles, and that there were job roles at a range of levels, and therefore we're representing a range of perspectives, from cybersecurity leadership within organizations to the engineers and analysts actually configuring these controls and working with them on a day-to-day basis. There are also a range of practitioners represented, working both internally to organizations such as CISOs, analysts, engineers, and externally such as consultants and penetration testers. These are the online survey results on control effectiveness. So on the left-hand side, we can see the responses made by participants when they were asked to rate the effectiveness of the 20 Centre for Internet Security controls. We can see that a majority of participants viewed all controls as being either effective or very effective. So these are the blue parts of the bar. On the right-hand side, we can see the count of the most effective and least effective bucket placements for control effectiveness. We can see that the controls perceived to be most effective were CSC3 vulnerability assessment, admin privileges, and instant response. And while this provides some indication of agreement, none of the numbers represent a particularly large proportion of the 30 respondents. We've got 7 majority here and 6 here. So it's apparent that the question divided opinion somewhat. For the controls perceived to be least effective, there was not really a very clear differentiation. And we think opinions on this question were too divided to allow us to draw very strong conclusions. So slide 10, the results are on control deployment. So the left-hand side shows the responses made by participants regarding the deployment of controls. We can see that there was a greater difference in opinion between participants than on the previous effectiveness question. And most of the controls obtained a range of ratings that ranged across all values of the Likert scale. On the right-hand side, we can see the mode ratings given to each control. And here we can see that some controls were considered to be deployed often or almost always on average. And these included malware defenses, boundary defenses, web and email defense, secure network devices. And these controls also had a highly positive comparison of non-neutral scores, which is the measure we use that compares the negative versus the positive scores, excluding the neutral, so the ratio of those. We can also see that some controls were considered on average to be deployed rarely or almost never on average. And these included vulnerability assessment, application security, and incident response. So interview findings on the factors affecting control effectiveness and deployment. For the interviews, there were 7 participants, 3 of whom had worked in cybersecurity at a senior level with 1 or more organizations, and 4 of whom had experience working as penetration testers. So again, we don't claim statistical significance here, but we're exploring the utility of the method for identifying these trends and influencing factors. And the influencing factors that, that came up during the interviews for control effectiveness included implementation. So a control's implementation can impact its effectiveness, the quality of the product used, its initial configuration, its treatment over time, for example, updates and adaptation in line with emerging threats. Secondly, the capabilities and motivations of threat actors need to be taken into consideration when considering control effectiveness, along with the assets that the control is actually defending. The wider organizational context has an impact, including the business use case of the network, the size of the network, and the size of the organization. And lastly, the interactions and interdependencies between controls impact on their effectiveness. In terms of factors affecting control deployment, so the factors that came up included that organizations prioritize the protection of their crown jewels, and controls are often deployed with a focus on this. The sensitivity of the assets handled by an organization can impact on its deployment of controls, and companies handling highly sensitive data may be more likely to, for example, have segmented their networks effectively. The sector can impact on priorities and therefore on control deployment. So examples were that organizations in the defense and security sector, it was felt, are likely to be more concerned with preserving confidentiality of data. In the private sector, reliance on the approval of stakeholders makes financial risk a key driver in the adoption of controls. Regulation can, of course, drive the deployment of controls in certain sectors and in organizations carrying out certain types of business. And finance and defense was cited multiple times as sectors in which control deployment is thought to be more advanced in general. We also had the existing infrastructure of an organization that can impact on its control deployment, for example, securing legacy versus more recent systems. The existing security maturity of an organization may influence its selection of cybersecurity standards and therefore the controls it deploys. And lastly, the size of an organization can impact on its control deployment. And it was thought, for example, that SMEs are less likely to have deployed controls as thoroughly as larger organizations in general. And that SMEs might be beginning with basics such as antivirus software, patching and firewalls, or may even be outsourcing systems and security to cloud providers. So to reflect a bit on the relevance of these results to stakeholders, we believe they're relevant for researchers seeking to reason about and measure organizational cybersecurity risk, and an insight into collective knowledge and perceptions of security practitioners addressing these risks on a day-to-day basis can help to refine this understanding and ensure that research is aligned with current industry practice. We believe they're valuable for organizations making decisions on the implementation of risk controls, so determining prioritization of deployment of risk controls and their likely impact on overall cybersecurity posture is challenging, and the collective views of the expert community are a valuable resource on this topic. Providers of cybersecurity standards and guidance. So we might assume that these would align with our results somewhat, that they might provide an indication of effectiveness, or that since organizations might use these standards to select controls, that they might provide an indication of deployment frequency. And so to explore this, we examined 6 key industry standards: the Center for Internet Security Standards, the NIST framework, ISO 27002, GCHQ's 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, Cyber Essentials, and COVID 5. And we found strong alignment with frequent reference to our most effective controls across all 6, which implies that these standards are recommending controls perceived to be most effective by practitioners and that they play a key role in guiding the adoption of controls by organizations. Finally, for the cyber insurance community, so a refined understanding of control effectiveness could inform pre-screening forms, enable more accurate calculation of insurance provisions for an organization based on the residual risk they face having deployed controls, and inform guidance given by the insurance industry on risk control products. And furthermore, in calculations of residual risk for organizations in which data on the deployment of controls is lacking, assumptions might be made about the likelihood that controls are in place based on results such as these on control deployment frequency. So to explore this, we compared the controls most frequently referenced in 24 insurance forms offered by insurers in the UK and US with our results. And we showed that we found that there was relatively less strong alignment than with the standards, at least. So our most effective controls were referenced relatively little, and there was less strong alignment with our deployment results as well. So there'd be value in further exploring discrepancies such as this between data collection by the insurance community, key standards and guidelines, perceptions of the practitioner community. As future work, we think it'd be valuable to explore the preconceptions that practitioners may have. So really, in order to understand the validity of both commonly held and differing beliefs, it's important to further comprehend their basis. And so future research might seek to understand the preconceptions that underpin the beliefs of security practitioners, including the possible influence of widely held misconceptions and past experiences. Secondly, tacit knowledge. It would be worth exploring whether we can codify practitioners' tacit knowledge to enrich the knowledge base. So our research showed that practitioners are aware of information that's not reflected in standards, and the community may be benefiting from shared and tacit knowledge that's not totally formalized and documented. So there's value in exploring that. And lastly, follow-up studies to capture changes in perception over time. So since cyber risk and cybersecurity practice are fast changing, findings on control effectiveness and adoption may vary over time. And if methodologies such as this one are to be used to collect data, then it would be important to consider the lifetime for which the data remains relevant. And it would be valuable to repeat follow-up studies at regular time intervals to capture changes in perception over time. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. I'll stop the video presentation and invite questions.